Today is July 17th, 2007. We're at the Sheraton Waikiki Hotel in Honolulu, Hawaii. We're here today to interview Judge Betty Binns Fletcher in a brief video oral history to supplement a longer, more complete audio oral history. I'm Paul Friedman from San Francisco, and I'm here on behalf of the 9th Judicial Circuit Historical Society. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Paul.
I'm hoping that you'll do most of the talking here, and I thought the right place to start would be to tell us a little bit about where you grew up and about your family.
Well, I grew up in Tacoma, Washington. My father was a lawyer, my mother an artist, and at a very early age, I knew I was going to be a lawyer.
How early?
I think I was maybe 7 or 8 years old. I was very interested in what my father did, and he would occasionally let me go to the office with him on Saturday. In those days, lawyers worked on Saturday, and as a big treat, I got to go and watch important trials once in a while. And so from a very early age, I just knew that that was where I was bound for. My father had 3 daughters. Many years later, a son trailed along, and probably he would have been encouraged that person to be the lawyer, but I had the attention that I wanted from him to really help me to think what lawyers did and how they influenced the world. My father was a very interesting man. He had grown up on what they call a stump farm in Shelton, Washington. The trees had been cut, but it was too hard to get the stumps out, so they plowed around the stumps. Very poor family. In the high school at Shelton where he went, they had very few books, and he said he finally resorted to reading the dictionary. But he got himself off to college at Washington State, and I think he was the only Rhodes Scholar that ever came out of that institution. Wow. He went to Oxford and got first honors there, and then came back to his native state to practice law. So he wasn't just an ordinary guy.
Yeah. And when you went to his office or watched him in court, what sort of cases did he do?
In those days, everybody did everything, and the cases, I don't think I ever saw a criminal case, and I don't think he handled many, but it would be civil cases. I remember once it was a railroad case where people had been killed at a grade crossing, and he was representing the father and the children who'd survived and the mother who had been killed. I remembered that case.
Mm-hmm. So when you were young, did you tell your parents that you thought you'd wanted to be a lawyer, or was it something you just thought to yourself?
No, I actually talked with my father about it.
Mm-hmm.
And so when I went off to college, I studied history and then took pre-law at Stanford. And this was the time when World War II was coming on, and all the fellows were peeling off to go to war. So I went over to the law school in my junior year and spoke to the dean and said, suppose I could possibly begin to take some courses. Of course, they had very few students, so he said, well, it's going to be very difficult for you, but why don't you come and try? So I took a half of my courses in the law school, both my junior and senior year, so completed a year of law school. Mm-hmm. Then married my husband, who was going off into the Navy, was out of school and had 4 children before I went back to law school at the University of Washington and finished law school there. And
so what was the... Oh. Judge, you were 20 when you went to Stanford?
I was 16.
16. You're 20 when you graduated, right?
I guess I was 19 when I graduated.
When you graduated. So did you feel, was it scary to leave home and go to Stanford when you were 16?
No, but I'm surprised that my family let me out of the house at that age. But no, I felt very confident. And Loved Stanford.
And you met your husband there?
Yes. I was working as kind of a hostess in the dining hall, and he was one of the hashers. And so I was the only woman. There were 29 hashers, so we all ate together. So I kind of had the pick of the crop.
And you started law school after you graduated from Stanford?
Yes. Well, I had 1 year equivalent at Stanford,
right.
And then a 10-year hiatus, and then went back to the University of Washington for 2 years.
Okay, so it was what, 13 years between you finishing your undergrad and finishing your law school. And during that time you had your children?
I had my 4 children.
4 kids. And what are their names?
Well, Susan teaches at UCLA in the law school. Willie's on the court here. Catherine is the environmentalist and heads people for Puget Sound. And Paul, our youngest, is a medical doctor, and he's the medical director for group health.
So that was one of the things that I was interested in to hear about. Your father, of course your husband, you, Willie, Susan, and I know at least Leah. Are there any other grandkids who are lawyers?
Yes, I have a granddaughter, Sarah, Susan's daughter. She's also a lawyer. But she's thinking of a career change. She's gone back to school to become a teacher. She thinks that will be a more rewarding career for her.
Interesting. So did you know when you finished Stanford and began to raise your family, did you know that you wanted to go back and finish law school?
Yes, that was part of our marriage contract.
Okay. So what was it like after 10 years away from academics and whatnot to get back into the law school?
It was very interesting. I found that I could focus very easily, and I had a more practical perspective, and found law school very easy. When I had done it as an undergraduate, it had been somewhat challenging and somewhat mysterious. It all seemed much clearer when I went back.
And were there many or any women in your class at UFW?
There were 3 women in my class.
So you finished law school in 1956. Then what?
Well, I wanted to go to work, and so things were kind of primitive in law placement in those days. There was one professor at the law school who was kind of in charge of helping students to get interviews, and I told him that I wanted to practice with a law firm in Seattle, and I'd hope he could arrange for me to get some interviews. Nothing happened. Nothing happened. So I was walking down the faculty corridor one day, and his great big booming voice was saying, "Well," he was on the telephone, "you wouldn't want a woman, would you?" So I knew then that I wasn't going to get anywhere in that direction. So I took my resume and went around to the firms where my fellow law students were interviewing. I'd go in cold, speak to the receptionist, and say, "I want to see the hiring lawyer." They thought I was probably coming for a secretarial job, and they probably wondered who was getting fired. But I would get in to see the hiring lawyer, the partner that did it. And they would look at my resume and say, "Oh, lovely, wonderful resume. First in your class. Oh, well, that's very impressive. But you know, the law practice is not a place for a woman with 4 children. You just won't be able to concentrate, just wouldn't work." So I didn't really make any progress until one law firm, one of the young partners, was very interested in my resume and in my persistence, and so he talked other partners into interviewing me, and I talked with all the other partners. But they then said, "Well, Charlie isn't here." And Charlie, the most senior partner, we're afraid he never would want a woman. So I went back out to the law school quite disheartened, talked with one of my professors who was kind of sympathizing with me, and he said, well, Charles Horowitz always comes to the law review banquet. You come, and I'll see that you sit by him and you sell yourself. So I went to the banquet, sat by Charles Horowitz, and went about selling myself as best I could. And after we'd talked for a while, he said, what's your father's name? And I told him, and he said, you know, this Jewish boy would never have gotten a Rhodes Scholarship if it hadn't been for your father. So that was kind of the old boy network that got me my job. And that firm, at the time, had 8 lawyers. It was Preston, Thorgrimson, and Horowitz. Now, that firm has only 1,500 lawyers. It's just changed. Fitzpatrick and so, K&L, Gates.
And so you started at the Gates firm in 1956?
Right.
And you were the 9th lawyer?
8th.
8th or 9th?
Yeah.
And what did you do as an associate? What kind of work?
Well, I started out, Charles Horowitz had quite a big case going, a suit against General Motors for one of the big distributors in the Northwest, and they needed a lot of briefing done quickly. So I was there every night. They were in trial, and I was briefing and getting ready for the next day, so that was the way I started out. And then just had a variety of things that I did for different lawyers. In those days, there was not too much specialization, and everybody was kind of handling everything. So I did just a variety of things.
Were there other associates? Or?
Yes, there were 3 other associates.
And you were the first woman?
First woman.
And was it, were the hours long? What was it like in terms of the practice then?
My hours were long. Some of the other lawyers' hours were not that long, but I was determined, of course, to be a success and to show that I could handle the work. So I was in early and often out late. But we never had dinner until I got home. The children were expected to do their homework, get themselves ready for bed, and then we'd have dinner when I got home.
So what time might that be?
Well, usually probably 8 o'clock.
Yeah. And going back to the story about Mr. Horowitz, had your dad been on the Rhodes committee for Washington?
He'd been on the selection committee.
And I assume in those days there was no partnership track. Was there anything that you knew how it would work, or that
Well, you know, the culture at that time was that if you went to work for a law firm, you were there for life, unless your work was less than satisfactory or something untoward happened. So I assumed that, although I wasn't sure, but I assumed that eventually I could be a partner. And
so how did that work? In 1962 you made partner, right?
Yes, and that was a little bit longer than others, but it was interesting, and I never quite knew why this was. This Jim Ellis, who was basically responsible for hiring me, came in and said, well, at the partnership meeting, you're not going to make partner this year, but I commit to you that you will be a partner a year from now. So I never understood what had happened there, but in any event, it did come to pass.
1 year later? And then talk about how did things change when you became a partner, and what was your, as the firm grew, what were the areas that you worked on?
Well, I supervised the probate department, and we had a fairly large probate practice. And I also did quite a bit of represented business clients. In Seattle at that time, there were a lot of quite prosperous small businesses, and we represented quite a few of them. So I did, well, I would do labor work, I would do petty commercial trials, and occasionally a fairly large trial. I had a couple of trials which started out as we thought going to be really kind of boilerplate contract litigation and turned into antitrust cases. Mm-hmm. And I asked the firm if I could associate Bill Dwyer with me, because Bill was very well known for antitrust work. So he and I tried a couple of antitrust cases together. And in one of them, something that never happened to me again, and he said never happened to him, the jury gave us more than we asked for.
These were plaintiffs' cases.
Yes,
right.
Yeah, we were plaintiffs.
Those are tough cases.
Right, right. Mm-hmm. So it was just a really general practice.
How did you enjoy trying the cases?
I loved it. I loved it.
What did you like about it?
Well, just kind of the challenge of putting together the evidence, interviewing the witnesses, figuring out just how we were going to handle things. Bill was an absolute master, and I learned a great deal from him. We thought a lot about how we were going to be telling our story to the jury, how we were going to arrange our witnesses, who would come first, what we could expect out of them, how we would structure the questions. Oh, it was he was a genius, really, and I just learned a great deal from him.
So what were some of the other highlights of your years of practice at Preston? Well,
Charles Horowitz was president of the Bar Association about the second year that I was there, and he came in to me and he said, you know, the Bar Association has never had a newspaper or bar bulletin. I think we need one, and you're going to be the editor. So I became an editor of a newspaper for the Bar Association, which really gave me an opportunity to get acquainted with the bar in Seattle and to figure out who was who in the legal community. And I would talk with the judges, I would talk with the lawyers who had important cases, and so that was kind of my start in bar work. And then I was asked to run for secretary. They'd never had any other position for a woman except that of secretary. And so I was bold enough to say, yes, I'll run for secretary, but I want a commitment that at some point, if I've done well, that I might be considered as a trustee. And that came to pass, and then ultimately I became the president of the local bar association. I enjoyed that work, and I enjoyed also, I became active in the Children's Home Society of Washington, which was a charitable organization, mostly an adoption agency at that time. And I helped to write the reform of the adoption laws. And then when times kind of changed and women began to want to keep their own children or to have abortions, I helped the agency to kind of transition into a new way of doing things, which I enjoyed. Then when the women's movement got really going, I got going with that also. And we then had a very progressive Republican governor. I don't know how that happened, but Governor Evans was really a very forward-thinking man, and he decided to establish a women's commission. And I became a part of that, and we were able to get the Equal Rights Amendment passed, not only to our state constitution, but also passed the federal one. And then I chaired the committee for abortion reform. We were able to get it passed through the legislature, but they referred it to the people for a vote. So I was involved in radio speeches across the state and various activities. We got it passed by the narrowest of margins. And then I was involved with an organization which at my confirmation time caused a little problem. It was called Coyote. I don't know whether you know about Coyote. Come off your old tired ethics. But it was an organization to help the prostitutes. We tried to help them to get out of the game, or we tried to improve their health care and other social services for them. So the law firm was very tolerant of my activities, except, of course, had to put in a full day's work at the office.
And how much did the firm grow during the years that you were a partner?
Well, when I left to go to the court, we had 85 lawyers in Seattle. We had 25 in Washington, D.C. We had, I think, 4 in Anchorage. And I don't think we'd opened our Spokane office yet. But we had, all of us worked very hard. It was a very hard-working firm. And we had a good community presence. One of the partners, Jim Ellis, was very active in community activities. And we had a reputation for hard work, excellence, good client service. So
I think I read that you once represented William O. Douglas?
Yes.
How did that come to be?
Well, Charles Horowitz represented him. This connection came through a fellow named Saul Hass, who had radio and television in Seattle, been quite an active politician nationally, and he knew Douglas, and he had brought Douglas to Charles Horowitz as his client. And I actually, well, he wanted wills and he had some property transactions, and I actually did the work and then gave it to Charles Horowitz, who presented it. And I didn't see Justice Douglas. I just gave it to Charles, and Charles would see him from time to time. And then Charles Horowitz went on the bench. He became a judge in our state court system, became Supreme Court judge. And I got a note from Justice Douglas saying, Charles has always told me that you really did the work, and would you do me the honor to be my lawyer? So that was the way that came about. He had kind of the same kinds of transactions that any kind of a private citizen would have. It was real property and wills and that kind of thing. He was sued one time by a woman who was really deranged, and her complaint was that he was somehow destroying the world, and his environmental activities on the American River were things that she complained about. And so I had the job of trying to get that case dismissed, and Justice Douglas wrote me a note, and he said, now whatever you do, please don't humiliate her, which I thought was a very nice thing.
Well, the question that every judge gets, how did you become a judge? Going directly from a partner in a prominent Seattle law firm to the Ninth Circuit.
Well, it was kind of interesting. I had seen the executive order that President Carter put out saying that he wanted to change the method of selection of judges, and he was going to have merit selection committees, and he wanted the judiciary to look more like the face of America. He wanted minorities, and he wanted women, and he wanted them to have shown a commitment to justice, and he wanted them to be qualified. Well, I saw this, and then I thought, well, no, I don't think so. right at that time, I was had become a rainmaker for the firm through some representations that I'd done of a local businessman that involved my working with Cravath Swain in New York. Cravath called me one day and said, would you come back to New York? We have Japanese clients that we would like you to meet. They need representation in Seattle. And in these negotiations we've had, we've told them that you're tough, but you're fair. And we think that you're the one to represent them in Seattle. So through that, I had gotten several Japanese clients that were doing financial transactions with the Boeing company and others, and also represented a group that were doing contracts with Boeing to manufacture part of their parts in Japan. And this was kind of fascinating and interesting to do, and so I just didn't think I was going to even think about it. And then I got a call from the president of our state bar, who said he needed to see me. Well, I thought he was coming about bar business because I was kind of slated to be elected to the president of the state bar. So in any event, he came over with a whole group of lawyers. And they said, well, you know, we've been looking at that executive order, and we think it's you. You've got to apply. So I thought about it, and that was how it came to pass. I decided to go for it.
And did you know your United States senators?
Yes, very well. They were
Who were they?
Senator Magnuson and Senator Jackson. Senator Magnuson was the chair of appropriations in the Senate, and Senator Jackson had defense and that and other committees. So I did know them, and so I spoke to Senator Magnuson and said, I'm going to apply for this. And he said, well, you've got to get through those merit selection committees. If you can do that, then I'll see you go the rest of the way. So I think there were 93 people who applied and appeared. Not all of them appeared. They kind of selected out, I think, about 15 or 20 that they interviewed. And so then my name was one of 4 that was sent in to justice. For 2 would be selected from that. And so I thought I let the senators know that my name had gone in, and so that seemed to be all that was needed. But one day I got a call from a woman who said, you don't know who I am. I can't give you my name, but I will tell you I'm in the Justice Department, and you're not going to be appointed unless you know people in high places. And I thought, well, this is kind of a nut call. But I called Senator Jackson's administrative assistant, and he said, oh, there's nothing to it. The senators have let the president know that you're to be one of the nominees. And then he called me back about 2 hours later, and he said, there's a lot to this. And he said, Senator Jackson and Senator Magnuson are going to see the president at 8 o'clock tomorrow morning. And
wow.
So that was that. There was a senator, I guess maybe I shouldn't for this purpose name the state, but who had great difficulties with his re-election. There was some charges of corruption and so forth, and whether they were true or not, I have no idea, but he pledged to Carter that he would vote for certain measures that were very important to the president at that time. And what he needed was a judge appointed from his state. And so, in any event, that was the problem.
Mm-hmm. So when you got the nomination, was there anything remarkable or controversial in the Senate?
No, you know, in those days things were a lot smoother. Unbeknownst to me, a man whom I had served on the ABA Ethics Committee with told me that he had gone around and spoken to each of the Republican senators and told them that he'd visited in our home and he'd met my family, and that I should get through the process without any trouble. And the way the Republicans handled that was none of them appeared at the hearing. But I think I did get a questionnaire from Thurmond, and he was very interested in my coyote representation, and a whole list of questions which suggested that I was probably far too liberal, and being a woman, I probably would have some trouble, but it never materialized.
What was the vote
of
the Senate?
It was on the consent calendar.
Oh, okay.
So
did you ever, we only have 1 or 2 more minutes, I guess, but did you ever dream that your son would follow you onto the Ninth Circuit?
No, never.
And did Willie and Susan, like you, know from an early age that they wanted to go into the law like their parents?
No, in fact, Susan was going to specialize in linguistics. She had very fine talent in languages. And Willie, when he was at Oxford, was studying Beowulf and thinking that he was going to be a professor of classics. But he found the market was not exactly too good at that time, and so he decided to take a fling at law school.
You went to a good one. So I think in September it'll be 28 years since you went on to the circuit. Is that right?
Right.
What about what's your best memory?
Well, I suppose the case that I cherish the most is Santa Clara Transportation Corporation against Johnson. This was a case where a woman had been a secretary and wanted to become a dispatcher and wanted to work on the road crews. And because Santa Clara at that time was trying to put forward affirmative action, she was given these positions and was given some supervisory job over a man who then sued. And the case went all the way to the Supreme Court. Judge Wallace had dissented, and it went to the Supreme Court, and I was affirmed on the basis of not exactly affirmative action, but equal protection.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Judge Fletcher. This has really been a terrific opportunity. Appreciate it. Aloha.
Thank you.